November 12, 1999. A gravel road outside the quiet town of Tellurian Ridge. A metal flare tore the sky open, and something, the size of a suitcase, struck the field like a comet. The air smelled of ozone and rain. He was there because he took the late shift at the repair shop. He was there because he made a choice that night that would make him listen to a thing no one else was meant to hear. What he heard would change the origin story he had carried like a stone in his chest. You were about to learn what was inside a bag older than any archive, an object that named his debt and offered a way to release it. If you want to follow this journey and learn the 3 steps that freed him, subscribe now and check the pinned guide in the first comment. Stay with us and you will see a before and an after. Daniel Saya was 42 years old and had believed for most of his life that misfortune followed him like a shadow. Daniel grew up in a house with a kitchen that always smelled faintly of burned coffee and of the mineral dust his mother shook from the laundry after days in the mines. As a boy, he learned to fix radios and to listen, close and patient, to the crackle between stations. He learned languages by ear, a trick with syllables and rhythm that later made him a careful listener when people did not speak plainly. In his teens, he left town, learned carpentry from a cousin, and returned with hands that could make a table look like it had always belonged to a room. He loved the arithmetic of wood joints and the neat certainty of plans. He was not supposed to be poetic. He carried a small scar on his right eyebrow from a motorcycle accident at 23. The scar had an odd habit of tingling on damp nights, a small reminder of limits he could not name. He married once and parted once. Money never stayed, opportunities walked away. The pattern of his life was repetition with slightly different furniture, a long century of things that almost worked out. At 42, he kept a box of unpaid bills sealed with an elastic band and a photograph of his sister smiling in a hospital bed. That hospital had been the last place he promised he would be better. He made promises as if they were receipts and found they never returned the favor. He said to himself that perhaps he had inherited a weight, a contract signed in a language he could not read. The feeling in his chest on the night the metal hit the field was not surprise, but a slow recognition, as if the world had finally delivered the reason for a lifelong ache. He thought, briefly and oddly, of a childhood dream where doors opened to rooms that were not rooms. The impact site was a circle of trampled grass and a heat that left the air shimmering. The object was not burning, but emitted a cold blue light like a bruise. There was the smell of metal and something sweet beneath it, like preserved figs. Daniel crouched, fingertips grazing scorched soil, and found a bag half buried and humming with a sound he could feel against his molars. He had no flashlight. His pocket radio clicked and hissed with static, and for a moment a human voice said nothing, and then a single syllable in a tone that suggested both apology and explanation. The thing was not alone. Behind the shrub, a shape breathed and tried to rise. It smelled faintly of wet linen and wet stone. It was not tall. Its skin was the color of wet sand. Its eyes were too large and dark. It blinked, and something inside its chest glowed, then faded. Daniel moved before he thought. He wrapped the alien in a sweater, carried it to his truck, and drove in a fog of adrenaline and the smell of rain. He kept one hand on the bag the alien had clutched like a talisman. In the truck, the alien tried to speak. Not with sounds at first, but with images that flashed behind Daniel's closed eyelids. A corridor lined with carved faces, a woman with a silver band over her wrist, a tablet with symbols like rivers. Daniel made a decision no one in his town could understand. He brought the creature home. Inside his small living room, the ceiling bulb hummed. The alien lay on a blanket over his couch and slapped with fingers curled around the frayed cloth of the bag. Daniel cleaned a wound that bled a slow black, and the air filled with the metallic tang of something like iodine and old rain. He opened the bag. Inside was a folded cloth, a disc of stone no larger than his palm, and a small amber vial sealed with resin. The cloth held a pattern that flickered when light touched it, a weave that seemed to map constellations rather than simple design. The stone disc had grooves worn by hand and a center hole that hummed when he held it. The vial smelled of earth and cedar and a spice he could not name. He felt the world tilt slightly and then right itself. The alien woke and spoke for the first time in his kitchen. Its voice was thin and clear and not formed by lips. Telepathic speech floated into Daniel's mind like a dropped ring. He felt the words as temperature and pressure more than as sound. The creature said one sentence that was both instruction and confession. It said that the bag was Anunnaki. It said that what lay folded in its cloth was a record, a registry of vows made across lives, bound to souls like chain links of promise. It said that the item had been hidden, to keep a particular style of debt from passing into a new life. Daniel felt his own name in the sentence, and a heaviness seize his ribs. He had always thought of the word Anunnaki as legend and myth. To hear it used with the authority of the star-born being itself altered the scale of what he believed possible. He was not the only witness to the scene. Marcus Hale, the sheriff, arrived an hour later after the neighbor Tomas Rivera called with a message about a strange light. Marcus smelled gasoline and wet leather and had a voice like gravel moving. He stood at the doorway, flashlight beam shaking, and watched with professional disbelief. Sarah Klein, a nurse from the clinic, came to treat the creature when Daniel insisted and when Tomas finally convinced her to see for herself. Dr. Elena Marquez, a visiting archaeologist, arrived the next day after a phone call to a university. She smelled of old books and perfume and carried a small leather case of tools. Professor Aaron Black, a cosmic archaeologist known for maverick theories, offered to authenticate the disc. Leila Omari, a linguist, traveled from the city the following week to catalog the symbols. Miriam Patel, a museum curator, kept a careful distance but took notes on chain of custody. Jonah Reyes, Daniel's old friend, brought coffee and watched the house like a sentinel. Each person placed one finger on the story from a different angle. Their names became part of the weight and the counterweight to Daniel's private fear. Conversations multiplied, and the bag, which had been quiet as a closed mouth, took on the air of an object that had been waiting for patient ears. Dialogues in those early days were crowded and urgent. Daniel asked the alien about origins. The alien replied with images and then with words. Daniel asked why it had chosen him. The alien said he had not chosen so much as been chosen by circumstance. Dr. Elena asked for the disc. Daniel hesitated and then handed it over. Aaron warned about publicity. Miriam asked about legal rights. Marcus worried about public safety. Sarah asked if the creature felt pain. Layla translated a pattern into a partial phrase. Jonah tried to make a joke. Daniel listened to all of them and felt the bag like a pulse against his palm. The conversations became a rhythm he could not escape. At one point, Daniel asked aloud, "How do vows stick to a soul?" And the alien looked at him like someone watching a man explain water to a fish, and sent the answer not as a sentence, but as a memory. An altar, a flame, the tightening of teeth to swear a promise under a sky with two moons. The stone disc was examined in the light of university lamps. Aaron placed it under a scanner that clicked like a slow insect and found faint radiocarbon traces that suggested a weaving of isotopes older than recorded human history. Metallurgy. Layla traced symbols that matched a proto-script theorized to be used by priest classes in early river civilizations. Elena found residues in the cloth that matched resins used in ancient embalming and in lustral rites. Miriam catalogued chain of possession with the reverence of a guardian. Their voices were clinical and solemn. Daniel sat and felt a pressure like a thumb over his sternum. The alien explained an origin story in images of ships gliding over stars and in phrases like chosen custodians and hidden registries. It described the Anunnaki as travelers who catalogued debts and vows across incarnations, who sometimes sealed records to prevent karmic weight from collapsing a soul into cycles of suffering. The bag had been made to separate a particular votive knot from a timeline. In his chest, something old and entire, a ledger of habits and heartbreaks, read his name and the pattern he had walked for decades. The visions began the night the disc was placed on his kitchen table under a lamp. They did not come as dreams, but as sequences that overran his fingers like warm syrup. The first memory took him to a low temple by a river. He smelled smoke and wet clay and the tang of fish on nets. He was not Daniel in that life, but a young scribe named Ishar, who learned to write with a reed and whose hands were forever ink-stained. He felt the grain of reed, the rasp of tablet against his palm, the cool rush of water below the steps. In that life, he had been tasked with recording vows for a priest of the fields. His voice joined a chorus that pledged a harvest in exchange for service. He tasted barley and sour milk. He remembered a woman who braided wheat into his hair at a festival and whose forehead he kissed in the dark. He also remembered the moment the priest asked him to bind a promise with a phrase that would not be spoken again. The binding felt like wrapping a rope around his ribs. He had thought it noble. He had thought the vow would be small. His memory ended with the tablet being sunk into mud and a hand, heavy and certain, pressing down. The second vision shifted him to a high plateau where stone circles sang in wind and the smell of pressed herbs filled the air. He was then called Ram, a healer with soot under nails and a tenderness for those with fever. He remembered the grainy sensation of clay on his knees and the bitter taste of a tonic he brewed from nettle and iron. He sat for a pact with a traveler who promised protection in exchange for a life of service. The vow became a lock. He felt it like a sinew pulled taut around his collar. The traveler sealed the promise with a token that became a pain he could not name. Years later, Ram watched the settlement burn. The memory held ash in his mouth and the sound of children calling names. He felt guilt as a physical weight, and the vow as a path he could not step off, because to step off would mean erasing faces and debts, and the small ledger of kindness against cruelty he had been instructed to preserve. The third memory unspooled in a narrow alley in a port city. He was called Micah, a shipwright who once forgave a captain who robbed him of a house. The smell of tar and rope and the metal tang of sea at dawn flooded him. He tightened rivets and tasted brine. He swore under a mast to never abandon a debt because the ocean remembers. He remembered the feel of rope fibers under his palms and the weight of cargo down his spine. The vow that had sewn itself into him then took the form of repeated neglect in the next centuries. He felt how small omissions compound into a life of scarcity. Each memory layered conviction upon conviction until Daniel understood the architecture of his own failure. The disc showed him how bargains made under certain skies had wrapped around his souls across lifetimes until the bag had stepped in to hide the central node. A fourth vision placed him in a cold monastery where chants fell like slow stones. He was a monk named Aved who traded warmth for an oath of silence. He slept on boards and learned to count breath. The vow then became a vow against speaking a truth that would have undone a binding. In that life, he ceded a part of his voice to keep others safe. And in doing so, the path of silence hardened into a habit that, in later lives, translated into an inability to ask for help. The memory was crisp with the scent of wax and pine needles. A child reached for his robe and he turned away. The choice repeated like a groove in a record. A fifth memory brought him into a market square where spice and coin and curses of merchants braided together. He was called Nabu, a trader who allowed a ledger to be signed while drunk and then saw his family leave. He tasted bitter figs and copper coins. His vow there was to never trust luck. It calcified into a constant guarding against risk. Each life added a layer until Daniel saw the pattern. Promises held with the best of intentions had become chains that kept him from receiving abundance and from asking for care. Each of these flashbacks ran between 800 and 1200 characters in memory.
dense with sensation and logic, and with the slow reveal of a binding that the Anunnaki bag had been built to hide. The alien narrated over these visions not in the blunt language of blame, but in a cadence that made the ledger feel alive. It explained that the bag served as a failsafe. Certain vows
Are like threads that if mended to time will pull a soul into repetition. Guardians among the traveling ones sometimes intervened by isolating the knot. The Anunnaki had hidden this particular knot because the pattern it created threatened to collapse multiple lives into one narrow failure. The aliens said that Daniel had been the enumerated subject of the knot from many returns, and that the bag had been waiting in the dark until a being who could hear the record appeared. The revelation landed like a hand unclenching. Checkpoint pause. If any of you recognize that weight inside your own chest, write it in the comments. Tell us with a sentence that starts, "I always carry," and share one small recurring pattern in your life. Your words help others see similar threads and shape future stories. We read every comment and often craft new episodes from shared patterns. Now return to Daniel and what he did next. The ritual to liberate the vow was not theatrical. It required 3 steps and words that acted like a key. Recognition was first. Daniel had to name each life out loud and feel the gesture of naming like a release. He had to speak to the ledger the truth he had been avoiding. The alien guided him with an incantation that felt like a tuning fork. The second step was validation. He had to acknowledge the harm and the kindness, to sit with both and resist the urge to excise blame or invent heroism. The third and final step was liberation. He had to state a declaration that rewired intent and then perform a small act to physically symbolize the letting go. The alien taught him the phrases to repeat. They were simple and resonant, and like all true keys, they fit only when spoken from a place of honesty. The ritual instructions included precise breath patterns, a posture leaning forward, then open, and a closing action that Daniel chose as burning a small strip of the cloth that had once wrapped the vow. The act smelled of resin and pine. The stone disc thrummed and then grew still. The sensation of release registered as a cold cone that lifted from his sternum and unrolled like a tight band loosening. He tasted copper as if some internal vein had been unsealed. The ritual was performed in his living room with people who now mattered more than witnesses. The alien sat propped against pillows. Elena measured light and marked time. Aaron recorded frequencies and murmured about chakras and registers. Layla translated the ancient line into a modern cadence. Sarah held a bowl of water until Daniel placed his hands and felt the coolness seep. Marcus stood at the doorway, skeptical and then oddly reverent. Tomas smoked and refused to stop. Jonah kept eyes on the window as if ready for the town to spill in. Miriam cataloged the burned cloth ash into a jar. The incantation had syllables that landed like gentle stabs, and then like a sea that softens. Daniel recited the names of Ishar, Ram, Maicha, Aved, and Nabu. He felt each name like a bead sliding free from a string. He validated with a phrase the alien provided, and then declared a release line that began, "I return what is owed to the fields of memory, and I will accept kindness in the present." He burned the strip of cloth until it became a curl of ash. The ash smelled of cedar and rain and something older, like a cup left in sun. In the hours that followed, subtle things changed, and then larger ones asserted themselves. The first manifestation was small and private. Daniel found an envelope on his doorstep with a check for a small overdue payment. He noticed that the check did not set his chest racing. He accepted it with a different steadiness. He paid one bill and felt the action lift a small stone from his sleeping pile of obligations. The second change was visible. A client who had rejected his bid weeks earlier called to offer a job, a steady renovation that would last months. He felt no disbelief, only a practical flaring of energy. He took the job and negotiated better terms. He slept without the old itch behind his ear, and for the first time in years woke with a plan. The town noticed. Jonah commented that he seemed lighter.
Sarah said his laugh had found new edges. Marcus observed he had stopped flinching at knocks on his door. Each small victory stacked and formed a new platform. But tests arrived, deliberate and old. A temptation came in the form of an opportunity to take a quick, easy contract that would have required him to cut corners. An old mechanism in his body recognized the pattern and pulled like a tide. He almost agreed. He felt the old vow whispering that survival meant accepting compromises. He paused and used the ritual tools the alien had taught him, to steady breath, to speak the release line quietly into his palm, to leave and sleep on the decision. He refused the contract. The second test was larger and social. A former lover returned with an offer to join a venture that would have required him to silence truth about their past. Old patterns that protected by silence rose like smoke. He named the pattern to Layla and Sarah, and they held the space while he said no. Each refusal confirmed the release and tested the new edges of who he would be. The world pushed to see if the old grooves still guided his choices. He passed, not because the tests were easy, but because he had practiced the ritual steps until they became a reflex. Alongside personal tests came public curiosities and some danger. A reporter asked to buy the story, and Aaron warned about exposure. A group of local men, curious and afraid, gathered near his property at night with flashlights and questions.
That tasted of accusation. Marcus calmed them and explained that safety and care were priorities. Miriam coordinated with the museum to ensure the chain of custody was respected. Dr. Elena arranged for a secured study of the disc and the bag. The alien, weaker each day, explained that it had been a guardian and not a thief, and that its people had tried to steward balance, but sometimes overreach had been the human cost. It asked for a promise that the bag would not be exploited. Daniel accepted stewardship with humility and put the disc into the protection of the museum under conditions that the team wrote and signed. The months that followed became a slow and measurable unfolding. 1 month later, Daniel had a steady streak of days where his breathing came easier. He had completed the small renovation and received a modest bonus. He slept with windows cracked and discovered the smell of wet soil again without the old spike of dread. He met with Miriam to document the bag and received copies of the analysis that showed traces of resin and script older than recorded cuneiform. He wrote down for himself a new daily practice drawn from the ritual: morning naming of intention, midday validation pause, evening declaration of release. His social circle noticed a different tone in his interactions. Jonah arranged a small dinner where Sarah brought soup and Marcus brought a bottle of something smoky. They teased him gently, and he laughed without the old edge. The alien sent him dreams that felt like postcards, a corridor lit with time, and a voice that said, "Well done." The town spoke in whispers that shifted to curiosity. A neighbor fixed a broken fence without being asked. For the first month, the ledger seemed to thin, and his chest grew quiet. 3 months later, Daniel had taken a more substantial leap. He refused a larger contract that would have required him to cheat a client, and instead invested in a partnership with a fellow craftsman. Miriam introduced him to a community program that subsidized better tools, and he bid on a municipal restoration job that he won legitimately. Money moved differently. He bought a small new tool set and slept without the old habit of checking doors 3 times. He began volunteering with Sarah at the clinic, teaching basic carpentry to teens. The rituals had not become magic that erased difficulty. Hard days persisted. Bills came. He still had to work. But where before obstacles felt like final verdicts, they now felt like challenges to be met and negotiated. He taught a short ritual at a community circle, careful to strip any appropriation from it, to show other people recognition and release techniques. The alien weakened but smiled in a way that hurt his chest. Professor Aaron presented preliminary findings at a small symposium, and the disc drew attention from scholars who began to discuss ancient custodial practices beyond legend. A letter arrived from an online forum, where someone who had seen an image of the bag wrote about a family pattern broken by a similar ritual. The ripple was tangible. 6 months later, life had shifted enough that the pattern of scarcity no longer defined Daniel. He had a contract that would last the year, better than his usual short engagements. He had reconnected with his sister and helped her with a medical expense without the old panic that would have made him hide. The small practices had become second nature. Jonah and Tomas joked about him having turned into a temple worker, and Sarah told him he had become reliable in a way that made their clinic schedule easier. The museum confirmed that the disc bore a layered script that suggested a type of registry used by traveling custodians who sometimes intervened to keep certain vows from repeating destructively. Dr. Elena published a careful piece with academic humility. Miriam arranged a small exhibit that contextualized the disc without sensationalism. The alien left in a light like a sigh. It had one final conversation with Daniel where it said that not all bindings should be removed and not all debts were unjust. It taught him how to listen to the difference between a bond that held love and one that repeated harm. Daniel planted a small tree in the field where the object had fallen as a marker of gratitude and of presence. Alongside this public tale are technical notes that matter for anyone who considers ritual work. The central procedure requires 3 clear steps. Recognition means naming the past events in present tense with sensory detail for at least 5 minutes. Validation requires acknowledging both harm caused and harm endured, and holding both without collapse into shame or justification. Release is a spoken declaration that promises a concrete action in the present, then performed symbolically. Breath timing matters. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, and exhale for 6. Repeat 3 times before speaking the release line. Physical acts can include burning a strip of cloth, burying a token, or pouring water into earth, chosen to fit cultural context and consent. The community around Daniel shifted too. Marcus learned to listen to weird stories without immediate dismissal and taught a class on community safety that referenced curiosity and care. Dr. Elena developed protocols for how to work with anomalous artifacts. Aaron continued to push boundaries with caution. Layla worked to translate the disc, and her notes helped reframe ancient scripts as practical tools rather than mere curiosities. Miriam developed an exhibit that honored provenance and the story of those affected rather than the spectacle. Jonah and Tomas fixed up the old repair shop and painted its door a hopeful blue. Sarah started a support group where people could practice recognition exercises. Each person became a filament in a network of repair. If you feel a similar chord inside your life, if you have a recurrent small harm you cannot explain, consider a practice of naming
and letting go. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to the channel to follow more journeys like this. We post guides and transcripts and a short workbook that outlines the 3-step ritual safely and respectfully. If you try a gentle version of the ritual, speak to a trusted friend and avoid any act that asks you to release legal or medical obligations without professional advice. Comment with "I always carry" and one recurring pattern in your life. Your comment might be the map someone else needs. The final image is simple. Daniel stands in the field wrapped in a jacket that smells like cedar. The ground is cool. The new tree is a sapling leaning toward afternoon light. He breathes and knows he is held not by his old vows, but by a network that includes people and practice and a story that expanded to include kindness. He takes no credit for cosmic favors and no more fear that his life is an unchangeable ledger. He keeps the memory of the alien in a small wooden box in his closet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that some interventions come from outside and some come from work within. The last line of the book he wrote one night reads that some burdens are meant to be named before they can fall. If you want to learn the steps in a printable guide, we linked below, and we will continue to explore other stories where artifacts, held records, and people learn to undo old knots. Remember to subscribe and to share a sentence that begins, "I always carry." The bag taught him that vocabularies of debt can be transformed by naming and by simple repeated acts, and that sometimes what is hidden in a woven cloth is not treasure but a way forward.